Walter Grayson stepped out of his old pickup truck and looked up at the bright glass windows of the luxury car dealership. The showroom gleamed under the morning sun, showcasing expensive cars that only a few could afford. Walter had always dreamed of owning one of these fine vehicles, and today he was finally ready to buy one. At 72 years old, Walter had seen a lot in his lifetime. He had worked hard, built a business from nothing, and saved wisely. Money wasn't an issue for him, but despite his success, he never cared for flashy suits or fancy watches. He preferred simple clothes, a worn-out jacket, comfortable jeans, and a pair of well-used boots. To him, appearance never mattered. It was the heart and the mind that defined a person, not the brand of clothes they wore. As he walked through the glass doors, the cool air of the showroom brushed against his face. The scent of new leather and polished metal filled the space. Rows of high-end cars lined the floor, their sleek bodies shining under the bright lights. Walter's eyes lit up with excitement. He had spent weeks researching different models, and now he was finally here to make his choice. He glanced around, looking for a salesperson. The showroom wasn't too crowded, just a handful of customers admiring the cars. A group of young salesmen stood near the front desk, chatting and laughing among themselves. Walter smiled and walked toward them. "Good morning," he said politely. The salesman turned to look at him. One of them, a tall man in a sharp blue suit, gave Walter a quick glance and then returned to his conversation. The others didn't even acknowledge his presence. Walter waited, thinking maybe they were busy. He didn't mind being patient. After a few minutes, he walked up to a nearby car and ran his hand along its smooth surface. It was a beauty, a deep blue luxury sedan with a leather interior. He could already imagine himself driving it, feeling the power of the engine beneath his hands. "Excuse me," he said again, this time a little louder. One of the salesmen, a young man with neatly styled hair, finally turned to him. His expression was less than welcoming. "Can I help you?" he asked, sounding more annoyed than interested. Walter nodded. "Yes, I'd like to learn more about this model. I'm looking to buy a car today." The young man gave him another glance, this time looking him up and down. His eyes lingered on Walter's old jacket and boots. A slight smirk appeared on his face. "Sir, these cars are quite expensive," he said slowly. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable looking at something else." Walter's smile faded slightly, but he didn't respond right away. He had faced judgment before in life, but he didn't expect it here, in a place where he was ready to spend his hard-earned money. He took a deep breath and stepped back. If they didn't want to treat him like a valued customer, he had no reason to stay. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the showroom, leaving behind the salesman who had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. Walter stepped out of the dealership and took a deep breath. The morning air was fresh, but something about the way he had been treated left a bad taste in his mouth. He had walked in excited, ready to buy a car, but instead, he had been ignored and dismissed like he didn't matter. As he reached his old pickup truck, he turned back to look through the glass windows of the showroom. The salesmen were still inside, laughing and chatting with other customers, completely forgetting about him. They hadn't even bothered to ask him what he wanted or how they could help. Walter shook his head. He had never been the type to judge people based on how they looked. Throughout his life, he had met all kinds of people, some wealthy, some struggling, some dressed in fancy suits, and others in clothes just like his. He believed that respect should be given to everyone, no matter their background or appearance. Yet in that dealership, it was clear that the staff only cared about those who looked rich. Walter couldn't help but wonder, how many other people had they treated the same way? How many customers had walked in, eager to buy a car, only to be ignored because they didn't fit the image of a wealthy buyer? As he sat in his truck, he replayed the conversation in his mind. "Sir, these cars are quite expensive. Maybe you'd be more comfortable looking at something else." The words stung, not because Walter couldn't afford the car, but because of the way they were spoken. The young salesman had assumed Walter wasn't worth his time. He hadn't asked a single question, hadn't even tried to be polite. Instead, he had dismissed him as if he didn't belong there. Walter sighed and started the engine. He had learned long ago that not everyone in the world treated people with kindness, but he had also learned another important lesson. Sometimes, life gives you a chance to teach others a lesson in return. As he drove away, a thought formed in his mind. It started as a small idea, but with every passing mile, it grew stronger. By the time he reached home, he had made up his mind. He walked into his house, set his keys on the table, and picked up the phone. There was someone he needed to call, his lawyer. Walter was not just any ordinary man. He was a retired businessman who had spent decades building his fortune. He had made smart investments, owned multiple properties, and had enough money to do whatever he wanted. And right now, he wanted to do something about that dealership. As the phone rang, Walter leaned back in his chair, a small smile forming on his face. The people at the dealership had no idea who they had ignored today. But by tomorrow, they were going to find out in the most unexpected way. Walter sat back in his chair, listening as the phone rang. A familiar voice answered on the other end. It was Mr. Carter, his longtime lawyer and trusted friend. "Walter, it's been a while. What can I do for you?" Mr. Carter asked, sounding cheerful. Walter smiled slightly. "I need some information, Carter. There's a car dealership in town, the one on Main Street. I want to know everything about it, who owns it, how well it's doing, and whether it's for sale." There was a short silence on the line before Mr. Carter spoke again, his voice curious. "That's an interesting request. Are you thinking of buying a car?" Walter chuckled. "Not exactly. Let's just say I had an experience there today, and now I'm considering something bigger." Mr. Carter didn't ask any further questions. He had known Walter long enough to understand that when he set his mind on something, he meant business. "Give me a few hours. I'll get back to you with the details." Walter thanked him and hung up. As he sat in his quiet home, he thought about his life's journey. He had started with nothing. No money, no special connections, just hard work and determination. He had spent years building a successful real estate business, making smart investments, and saving every penny he could. People often assumed wealth came from luck, but Walter knew better. It came from dedication, patience, and the willingness to take risks. But despite his success, he had never been the type to show off. He still lived in the same comfortable home he had bought decades ago. He drove an old but reliable pickup truck. He dressed in simple clothes, not because he couldn't afford expensive ones, but because he never cared about impressing others. Yet the way he had been treated at that dealership made him realize something important. People often judge others based on appearance, not on who they really are. And that was a mistake. A few hours later, Walter's phone rang again. It was Mr. Carter. "I found everything you need," his lawyer said. "The dealership is owned by a company that's been struggling financially for the past year. Sales are down, and they're looking for a buyer. If you're serious about this, you could own it by tomorrow." Walter's eyes gleamed with interest. "How soon can we set up a deal?" Mr. Carter chuckled. "With your resources, immediately. I'll handle the paperwork. If you're ready, this dealership could be yours before the sun sets tomorrow." Walter leaned back, a thoughtful smile on his face. The very place that had ignored him would soon belong to him. He could already picture the look on the salesmen's faces when they found out. "Let's do it," he said firmly. Tomorrow was going to be a very interesting day. The following morning, Walter woke up early. As the sun peeked through his bedroom window, he couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and anticipation. Today was going to be unlike any other day he had lived through. Today, the car dealership he had visited just the day before, the one that had dismissed him so easily, was going to be his. Walter went through his usual morning routine. He had always believed in staying grounded, no matter how successful he became. There was no need to rush or feel arrogant. After all, he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He had lived a life that needed no validation. He dressed in his usual attire, a simple shirt and slacks. There was no need to wear anything fancy, especially when he was about to make a significant change in the business world. He had learned over the years that it was not about what you wore or how others perceived you, but about the decisions you made and the impact you created. After a quick breakfast, Walter drove to the office. His lawyer, Mr. Carter, had already prepared the necessary paperwork. All that was left was the final step, signing the documents. Walter didn't hesitate. He knew exactly what he wanted. At the law office, Mr. Carter handed him the stack of papers. "Everything's in order, Walter. The dealership will officially be yours as soon as you sign here." Walter looked at the papers, his eyes scanning each word with careful precision. It wasn't just about buying a business. It was about sending a message that anyone, no matter their appearance, deserved respect. He signed the papers without a second thought, the weight of the decision settling in. "Done," he said with a smile, handing the papers back to Mr. Carter. "Let's make this happen." By the time Walter stepped out of the office, the deal was complete. The dealership, once owned by a company on the verge of collapse, now had a new owner. That owner, of course, was Walter. He didn't waste any time. He drove straight to the dealership, his mind already racing with ideas. He could already imagine the changes he was going to implement. It wasn't just about turning a profit. It was about transforming the way business was done. As he approached the dealership, Walter saw the familiar shiny cars lined up, waiting to be sold. But today, the dealership wasn't the same place he had walked into the day before. He was no longer just a customer. He was the boss. Walter parked his truck and stepped out, feeling the surge of satisfaction. He walked inside, ready to meet the team that would soon become part of his vision. The salesmen, who had so eagerly ignored him just a day ago, were busy at their desks, chatting and laughing as if nothing had changed. They didn't recognize him right away. "Excuse me," Walter said, his voice calm yet firm. The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward him, and that's when they recognized him. Walter didn't have to say another word. The realization of who he was hit them all at once. The man they had ignored was now the man who owned everything around them. The moment Walter entered the dealership, a tense silence fell over the room. The salesman, who had been joking and talking just moments ago, suddenly became aware of the man standing at the door. Their expressions shifted from casual to surprised, then to worried as their eyes locked on him. They had no idea who he was, or rather, who he had become. Walter didn't waste any time. He stood tall, his presence commanding attention. The showroom, once filled with light-hearted chatter, now seemed to hold its breath. The salesmen exchanged nervous glances, clearly unsure of what to do. They were all waiting for him to speak, wondering what would come next. "Is there a manager around?" Walter asked, his tone calm but firm. One of the younger salesmen, who had ignored Walter the day before, nervously stepped forward. I'm the senior sales associate here. Can I help you with something?" Walter smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that spoke of a lesson about to be delivered. "I hope so. I'm looking for the manager. You'll want him to be here when I speak." The salesman's face turned pale. He nodded quickly and walked toward the back office. Walter's eyes followed him, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction building inside him. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing anyone, but it was about making sure that this moment counted. It was about ensuring that no one in that room would forget the lesson they were about to learn. A few moments later, the manager emerged from the back office, his expression confused but polite. He approached Walter, offering a handshake. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" Walter didn't return the handshake right away. Instead, he looked the manager in the eye, taking in his crisp suit and polished demeanor. He could tell the manager had no idea what was coming. "I'm Walter Grayson," he said simply. The manager's eyes widened slightly. The name didn't ring a bell immediately, but Walter could see the wheels turning in the man's head. He could see him trying to place it, trying to figure out who this older man could be. Before he could ask, Walter continued, "I was here yesterday. I came to buy a car. Do you remember me?" The manager's face changed, a look of realization dawning on him. "Wait, you're the man, whoa." He trailed off, clearly embarrassed. "Yes," Walter replied. "I'm the man you all decided wasn't worth your time." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "And I'm the man who just bought this dealership." The manager's eyes grew wide, and the room seemed to get even quieter. The salesmen who had once laughed and ignored Walter were now standing in the background, frozen in shock. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected Walter to be anyone important. They hadn't expected him to walk in as the new owner. The manager stammered, unable to find the right words. Walter watched him, knowing that the man was at a loss for what to say. But there was no apology coming, no real acknowledgement of the mistake they had made. Walter wasn't expecting one, either. "I've made some changes," Walter said calmly. "You'll be hearing from my team later today. We're going to start with a fresh approach around here. It's time for everyone to learn what customer service really means." With that, Walter turned and walked out of the showroom, leaving behind a group of stunned employees, unsure of what the future held. He didn't need to stay. He didn't need to make a big scene. The impact of his words would settle in, and soon enough, the entire dealership would realize the truth. Walter Grayson wasn't a man to be ignored. As Walter walked out of the dealership, he felt a sense of calm, knowing that things were going to change. He didn't need to see the shock on their faces again. The seeds had already been planted, and now it was time for them to grow. He knew that his arrival would be the start of a new chapter, not just for him, but for the employees and the business itself. Later that afternoon, Walter's team arrived at the dealership. They weren't there to intimidate anyone or make people feel uncomfortable. Instead, they were there to set things right. Walter had made it clear that he wanted the atmosphere to change. No longer would it be a place where customers were judged based on appearance or assumed to be unworthy of attention. It was time for respect and professionalism to lead the way. Walter had asked his team to focus on retraining the staff, from the salespeople to the managers. The idea wasn't just about making them aware of what they had done wrong, but teaching them the right way to engage with every customer. Every person who walked through the door, no matter their background or their clothes, deserved respect and attention. The first meeting was set for the next morning. Walter had already prepared a speech, but this wasn't about grand words or long explanations. It was about sincerity, about showing them that a simple shift in attitude could make a huge difference. When the employees gathered in the conference room, there was a noticeable tension in the air. They had heard about the changes, but they had no idea what to expect. Walter stood at the front, looking each of them in the eye. He didn't stand above them, didn't speak down to them. Instead, he was simply a man who had been treated unfairly and who was now in a position to make things right. "I'm not here to lecture you," Walter began, his voice steady. "I'm here to give you a chance to grow. The dealership has been struggling because we haven't treated people with the respect they deserve. We've lost customers because we didn't take the time to understand their needs. And we've lost our own integrity in the process." He paused, letting the words settle in. The staff was listening now. They knew this wasn't just about selling cars. It was about changing the way they approached their work, the way they treated people. "I've been in business long enough to know that treating others with kindness and respect doesn't just make you a better person. It makes you a better professional. And this place will only succeed if we all commit to making every customer feel important." Walter's eyes moved across the room, making sure to lock eyes with everyone present. He wasn't giving a speech for the sake of words. This was a moment of truth. The salespeople, the managers, they all had a chance to turn things around. They could either embrace this new way of working or be left behind. He smiled, just slightly. "We'll start fresh. I expect you to greet every person who walks through that door with a smile, no matter what they look like. I expect you to ask questions, to listen, and most importantly, to treat everyone like they matter." The employees nodded, some still unsure, but others slowly beginning to understand the weight of what Walter was saying. He wasn't asking for anything impossible, just a change in mindset. Let's make this dealership a place where everyone feels valued. Not because it's good for business, but because it's the right thing to do. With that, Walter finished the meeting. He knew it would take time to fully change the culture of the dealership, but this was the first step. He had set the tone, and now it was up to the staff to follow through. As Walter left the conference room, he felt a quiet pride. The real work had begun. This was about more than just the cars. It was about creating a place where everyone was treated with dignity and respect. In the following weeks, things started to change at the dealership. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but the shift was unmistakable. Walter had spent hours working closely with his team, making sure the lessons about customer service weren't just words, but actions. Every day, there were meetings, small discussions, and training sessions. The dealership wasn't just selling cars anymore. It was building relationships. At first, some of the employees were uncertain. They were used to the old ways, the way things had always been done. But Walter's approach was different. He didn't focus on high-pressure sales tactics or flashy advertisements. Instead, he focused on creating a welcoming environment, one where customers felt valued no matter what they were looking for or how much money they had to spend. Slowly, the employees began to understand. They started to ask more questions, take more time with each customer, and offer their expertise without judgment. They no longer assumed that the person who walked through the door couldn't afford a car or didn't deserve the same level of attention as someone wearing a fancy suit. Every customer, no matter their appearance, was treated with the same care and respect. It wasn't just about selling a car. It was about understanding needs and building trust. Walter made sure his team knew that the goal was not to rush the sale, but to make the customer feel comfortable, listened to, and confident in their decision. Slowly but surely, the customers started noticing. Word began to spread about the dealership's new atmosphere, where everyone was treated with kindness. One afternoon, a family of 4 walked in. The parents, dressed casually, had 2 young children in tow. The sales team, no longer jaded by assumptions, greeted them with genuine warmth. The family wasn't looking for a luxury vehicle, just something practical and reliable. But the salespeople didn't treat them any differently than if they were buying the most expensive car on the lot. The family spent several hours discussing their options, asking questions, and testing out different models. There was no rush, no pressure to make a decision. The staff was patient, answering every question, and making sure the family understood all of their options. By the end of the day, the family drove off in a new car, happy, satisfied, and feeling truly cared for. This wasn't an isolated incident. Slowly but surely, the dealership began to gain a reputation. People who had once been turned away from the lot started returning. They saw the difference, the shift in how they were treated, the genuine attention to their needs. Word spread quickly, and the sales numbers started to rise. Walter watched all of this with quiet satisfaction. The changes he had implemented were working, not just in terms of sales, but in how people viewed the dealership. The atmosphere had transformed from one of judgment to one of understanding. But Walter knew there was still work to be done. It wasn't enough to just change how things were done. He needed to make sure the new values stuck, that they became the foundation of the business. Every morning, he reminded his staff of their core mission, treating people with respect, regardless of their financial status or appearance. Every afternoon, he checked in on the team, making sure everyone was on the same page. Over time, the dealership became known for its outstanding customer service. People came from miles away, not because they were offered the lowest prices, but because they knew they would be treated fairly. Walter had not only saved a failing business, he had transformed it into a place where people came not just to buy a car, but to experience something different, something that was rare in today's world, a place where people truly mattered. And through it all, Walter never lost sight of the reason he did it all in the first place, to make sure no one was ever dismissed or ignored again. As the months passed, the transformation of the dealership was nothing short of remarkable. Walter had done more than just buy a business. He had completely overhauled the culture, turning it into a place where respect and care were at the core of everything. Customers noticed the change, and they came in droves. Word of mouth spread like wildfire. People from all walks of life, from those looking for a budget-friendly car to those in search of something more luxurious, were eager to experience the difference. But what pleased Walter the most wasn't the increase in sales or the growing customer base. What truly made him proud was seeing his team embrace the new way of doing things. The employees who had once been skeptical now worked with a sense of purpose. They had seen firsthand how genuine customer care could transform the business. And it wasn't just about making sales. It was about creating lasting relationships with every person who walked through the door. Walter had built a community within his dealership. His team wasn't just a group of employees. They were a family, united by the goal of offering people something that went beyond a car. They offered trust, honesty, and a commitment to ensuring that every customer walked away with more than just a vehicle. They walked away with an experience. One afternoon, a man walked into the dealership who had clearly seen better days. His clothes were worn, his shoes were scuffed, and he had an air of quiet desperation about him. The salespeople who had once made assumptions might have dismissed him, but now they treated him no differently than any other customer. The man approached one of the sales associates, who greeted him with a friendly smile. "How can I help you today, sir?" the associate asked. The man hesitated for a moment, unsure. "I've been saving for a long time. I need something reliable for my family. I've got a tight budget, but I want to make sure it's the right choice." Instead of pushing him toward a more expensive option, the associate led the man to a few affordable, reliable models. The two of them spent a lot of time discussing each car's features, comparing prices, and making sure the man felt comfortable with his decision. The salesman never once made him feel less important or treated him with anything but respect. By the end of the afternoon, the man drove off with a car that fit his needs perfectly. He was grateful, not just for the car, but for the way he had been treated. And that was exactly the kind of experience Walter wanted to create for every single customer. It wasn't about the sale. It was about the lasting impression that would bring customers back, again and again. Walter stood in the showroom one evening watching his team interact with customers. He could see the positive energy in the air. People were happy, and the employees were genuinely invested in helping them. The dealership wasn't just a place to buy cars. It was a place to connect, to build trust, and to make a difference in people's lives. The world had a way of teaching lessons, and Walter had learned his own the hard way. He had been dismissed, ignored, and underestimated. But he had also learned the power of resilience. He had shown that anyone, no matter their appearance or circumstances, could make a difference if they were willing to stand their ground and demand respect. Walter didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. The dealership had become a shining example of what could happen when people treated others the way they wanted to be treated. As he looked out over the showroom, he felt a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just a success story. It was a story of transformation, not only of a business, but of a community and the people within it. Walter had proven that kindness, respect, and determination could turn any situation around, no matter how impossible it might have seemed. And as he smiled to himself, he knew that the lessons learned here would last for years to come.